It's an absolute pleasure to be here. This is my third MOTYF festival that I've been able to speak at. And it really is a really wonderful group of people and an always really enjoyable dialogue. So today I'm going to be giving a short survey of metaphors embedded within historical and emergent computer interfaces. You will see references to a lot of things that we've spoken about today. I want to stick specifically to the user interface, so I'll try to narrow things down a little bit, and specifically focus on issues of metaphor. I'll start with a very simple hypothesis. This is not grand thinking. The arc of human-computer interaction bends towards intuitive, everyday human behavior. This journey has required us to embed orientational and structural metaphors into our user interfaces as we seek to both mimic the experience of our physical reality and beyond. This arc points towards an emerging paradigm of user experience where our digital worlds and our physical worlds become one. And of course, this is a theme that you've heard about a lot today. So a quick overview of my talk. I'm going to begin with some of the foundational metaphors and conceptual models in user interface design. In the real and the virtual, I'm going to cover the mimesis and skeuomorphism that's been prevalent in the last 30 years of interface design. In semantic movement, I want to cover recent attempts to bind interface motion to spatial metaphor. Outside the frame discusses UI conceptions for engaging the entire body in experiences outside of traditional computer screens. Learning from game design is a short sidebar about some of the hard problems being explored by video game designers. And When Worlds Collide concludes with a discussion about virtual and mixed reality environments and the coming design challenges. So we begin with metaphor. Metaphor is an integral part of our language and thought. Through metaphorical reasoning, we use prior knowledge to understand new situations. Using metaphor, knowledge about a familiar domain is mapped to elements in an unfamiliar domain. In the context of user interface, metaphors provide a basic foundation for users to develop a mental model of a computer system and how it can be used. The goal of a well-applied metaphor is to give the user instantaneous knowledge about how to interact with the user interface. In the book Metaphors We Live By, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson expound a substantial theory on the place of metaphor in everyday existence. The book has been influential in interaction design circles because it has a strong emphasis on metaphor as key to human cognition. Lakoff and Johnson define a taxonomy of metaphor. Orientational metaphors deal with how we connect simple concepts to a form of space. A common example is how often upward movement represents positivity, and downward movement may denote sadness. Now, in a UI context, orientational metaphors are very simple ones. A slider moving up and down, mapping to the volume of a computer speaker. Or perhaps more interesting, how a next and back button are almost always on the left and right, respectively. Ontological metaphors use the stuff of everyday existence, such as objects, entities, and containers, to help explain other concepts. In a UI context, this means that a file is treated as an object or an entity. Computer files have sizes. They can be moved or destroyed. We think of them as physical things that we manipulate, when, of course, that's completely untrue. Text boxes are also containers that can be filled, right? And finally, structural user interface metaphors are those that identify a system concept with a real-world concept in order to help explain it. And these are probably the most common ones that we as UI designers work with. The most famous example is, of course, the trash can, the idea of how do I throw a file away. Here are three visual conceptions of space. All require us to read them, but they sit at different places on a spectrum between abstraction and naturalism. In our Egyptian wall painting, the space is codified. Scale and position have specific meaning. One needs to know how to understand the visual cues in order to fully understand its message. The Raphael, on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, presents its characters within a perspectival space aligned to our physical perception of the world. We can place human-computer interfaces on a similar spectrum. Our earliest attempts to make computers user-friendly was by making them resemble the common workplace of the time in a codified way. On the left is a 1974 example of what's called the paper paradigm. And Douglas Engelbart introduced this in 1968. And it's essentially still in use by most computer desktop operating systems. Black text on a white background, files within folders, and a desktop. Here, the intangible has been made tangible, and abstract and hard-to-remember commands and path names have been replaced with easier-to-perceive and remember visual spatial cues. This is what makes it easier to use. 5 years later, on the right, we are significantly farther along towards a sophisticated graphical user interface, involving windows, icons, menus, and a desktop. And then in 1984, Apple Computer launches the Apple Macintosh, which was the first affordable and commercially successful personal computer to include a graphical user interface. Now, there are several key structural metaphors here and in all of these types of interfaces that have to be maintained to make them work. The first is coherency. Each window is permanently and unambiguously associated with a single folder. And the second is stability. Files, folders, and windows go where you move them, stay where you put them, and retain all their other physical characteristics: size, shape, color, location, etc. But if we jump forward 28 years, we find Apple chasing the same model, and we start to see its weaknesses. The push towards realism and recognizability has a downside. We fall into what I guess I could jokingly call the uncanny valley of interface. These are examples of skeuomorphism, derivative objects that retain ornamental design cues from structures that were necessary in the original. A skeuomorph is about recognizability over actual function. This historic interface from 1996, which is one of my personal favorites, is a textbook case of skeuomorphism, and it moves us further down the spectrum towards spatial realism. This is the Sony Magic Link. It's a personal digital assistant, a PDA. Your desktop was a literal desk. You click on realistic objects placed on the table to access their features. Stored files and games are kept down the hall. You physically move through the interface. The metaphor here has been taken too far, resulting in an experience that becomes tiresome and repetitive. The problems with interfaces deeply aligned to metaphor were identified many years before, far before this, in the 1980s, through the research of Randy Smith at Xerox PARC. He explored the tension between literally following a physical metaphor and ease of use, functionality, and performance. Smith explored this through the development of his deeply metaphorical alternate reality kit, a research project undertaken at Xerox PARC in 1986, 2 years after the launch of the first Mac.
Hand casts shadow as it moves over this alternate reality plane, and objects in the plane can be picked up and thrown around. They retain the velocity they're given. They cast a shadow as they're picked up to indicate that they're in a domain called meta-reality, where they can be carried around and over even to other worlds. Let's look here at these two special kinds of objects. They're called interactors. They represent an interaction law of the environment like gravity or some law such as motion. For example, I can give an object some velocity here, and by removing the law of motion from the world, objects are no longer able to move, and I could carry that over to this world and move objects around here.
To diffuse the tension between physical metaphors and virtual environments, Smith, in 1986, proposed a literalism-magic distinction. He defined that we needed moments in interface that were magical, that enabled us to suspend disbelief when handling interactions that fall outside of what can be mapped to reality. So the use of a hand as a pointer, activating simple buttons, that's a literal interaction. Dropping buttons onto things, that's moderately magical. Interactors in multiple realities, highly magical. Smith's work was largely ignored by mainstream operating systems, but we will return to the concept of magic and the suspension of disbelief when I return to talk about game design. So does anyone remember this famous scene from Jurassic Park? How interface has been visualized in movies is another, probably far more interesting lecture. But this scene is often ridiculed for its representation of a three-dimensional file browser. Many people still believe that this is some sort of a terrible film fantasy. But the Fusion File Manager was a real free utility from Silicon Graphics. It was an early attempt to bring the Renaissance model of depth and perspective into user interface. At the time, in 1993, the advantages of this were not fully fleshed out. But just 10 years, not even 10 years later, just a few years later, we would see the work of Muriel Cooper and her students at the MIT Visual Language Workshop, exploring the value of providing three-dimensional views of hierarchical information. They created landscapes of information that could be explored and unpacked through movement, which leads us to our next topic. Since their inception, traditional graphic user interfaces were basically a series of static screens linked together without transitions. As computers got increasingly powerful, animation started to be used more frequently for things like maximizing windows or opening tabs. It was still mostly pressed into service for contextual change and rarely influenced the overall structure of interfaces. But what the work of Cooper and her team at MIT showed us is that animation is most useful when it reflects and reinforces the semantic relationship between elements. This idea has changed modern user interface design. Instead of designing screens and then adding transitions between them, today we begin by designing individual components and then think about how they change and move in different contexts. An interface is not a series of screens anymore, but a collection of semantic components inside a single continuous space. Increasingly, designers are being asked to ensure that movement within that continuous space is connected to spatial metaphors that are natural and realistic. Nowhere is this more clearly articulated than in Google's material design motion guidelines. I'll let it run through one last time. Okay.
Material design is alive. And it lives in a world a lot like ours. A world that's responsive, natural, aware, and intentional. Material design uses responsive animation to create energy. When you take an action, feedback is immediate, and it never keeps you waiting. Motion adapts to the distance an element needs to travel, focusing on how fast something needs to move rather than how long it should take to get there. Motion should feel natural, moving the way things do in the real world. Nothing should instantly start or stop. Elements in motion have momentum and take time to speed up and slow down. They respond to forces like gravity, moving in curved paths instead of in straight lines. Material is also aware of the world around it. The way something enters the screen can affect the movement of everything else. Elements can push other elements out of the way or attract them. Above all, material isn't random. There's a purpose behind every animation.
It's an entire education in motion design in a single piece of graphic standards. No company has done more to unify spatial and material metaphors with movement than Google has in its material design specifications. As Google writes, the material metaphor is the unifying theory of a rationalized space and a system of motion. The material is grounded in tactile reality, yet technologically advanced and open to imagination and magic. The fundamentals of light, surface, and movement are key to conveying how objects move, interact, and exist in space and in relationship to each other. So Google has helped us find consistency in our metaphors on desktop and mobile. But they, like many other tech companies, understand that the next evolution of computing will happen away from the screen, which brings us to the metaphors embedded in the movement of our bodies and our senses beyond sight. Natural user interfaces are systems for human-computer interaction that the user operates through intuitive actions related to natural, everyday human behavior. Gesture recognition systems track user motions and translate those motions into instructions. Above here is an example of switching menus on a Microsoft Kinect through the movement of hands. Eye tracking software transforms gaze into selection or action. Speech recognition allows users to interact with the system through spoken commands. Brain-machine interfaces read neural signals and use programs to translate those signals into action. Each of these technologies attempts to map familiar behavior to computer input. Spatial mapping, projection mapping, and computer vision move us outside of the frame of the computer screen, bringing these human-computer interactions into our own physical spaces. But such interfaces face significant usability challenges. Regardless of the approachability of the metaphors, many systems suffer from a lack of discoverability. The controls and affordances are non-existent or downright misleading. Additionally, these systems lack feedback and tactility. They exist in our world, but as shadows and light. They are somehow incomplete. Now, there is much research taking place to solve this problem via haptic and kinesthetic communication. One success story is Apple's Taptic engine, which recreates a sense of touch by applying high-speed vibrations to the user. You can actually see that shaking very, very quickly. This device, used in new iPhones, makes the user perceive button movement where none exists. The new iPhones have no moving parts. However, it feels like you push the button inward, and that's because it slaps your finger. When discussing interfaces beyond the screen, it's also important to identify the important work being done in spoken interfaces and chatbots. Apple Siri, Microsoft Cortana, Google Home, Amazon Alexa are all products that couple speech recognition with artificial intelligence to provide us with new models of interaction. But such systems are just the beginning. Place a system like that into your ears so it can filter, block, and modify the sounds you hear, and we move into the realm of mixed reality. Hear One by Doppler Laboratories that transforms everything you hear. One of their demos is real-time language translation. This is a product that will be released in February. Gesture recognition, spatial mapping, speech recognition, haptic feedback. This is an impressive list of technologies. But while each of these is having an impact, many feel unrefined and unresolved. It is the combination of these elements into a singular experience where we will start to see their true impact. Computer interactions are increasingly moving into our physical world. Or should I say our physical world and our digital world are becoming one. This provides many user interface challenges to solve. How do we suspend disbelief when the artificial enters our reality? How do we create affordances that are natural and intuitive? How do we provide pertinent information based on activity and context? One place to look for existing models and metaphors is game design. Of particular use is the concept of intradiegetic and extradiegetic interface elements. In cinema studies, refers to the internal world created by the story that the characters themselves experience and encounter, the narrative space that includes all parts of the story. Characters, objects, and actions which exist in the game world are classified as intradiegetic. Status icons, menu bars, and other UI, like you see above in the driving game, are not part of the game. They're not part of the game world, and they are considered extradiegetic. The in-game character doesn't know about it. The imaginary character driving the car does not see the things that are painted on the screen. Even though they may present crucial information to the player, they are outside of the game world. Several games have made attempts to create more immersive first-person experiences by only using intradiegetic elements. In this example, the map and the radio are not overlays, but objects the game character holds in their hand and manipulates. These objects are never seen or never interacted with out of the context of being able to see the rest of the hand. Keeping users within a game narrative often requires a suspension of disbelief. This game uses a simple yet effective way of leading the user through a game space. Perhaps you could say it's a magical way. And in a similar vein, in this game, Mirror's Edge, our vision is transformed to guide us along a path, the red objects telling us where to aim for. A ghost character exists in the space with us, providing comparison and competition. So you see, models for hybrid digital physical experiences have already been prototyped, if designers are looking in the right places. I'm going to close with two ways of blending our physical experience and digital experience. One is virtual reality, which is an immersive simulation of three-dimensional environments. And the other, which we've heard a lot about today, is computer-mediated, augmented, mixed, or blended reality, shown in this diagram as AR, although I prefer to use the term MR, mixed reality, which refers to the ability to add to, subtract information from, or otherwise manipulate one's perception of reality through the use of a wearable computer or a handheld device. While virtual reality is now in a boom phase due to rather inexpensive hardware, it is the emergent technology of mixed reality which, I believe, will have a larger long-term impact. The promise of MR is a world without computer screens, a place where the real and the virtual combine into one seamless experience. In VR and AR, the user is at the center of the experience, surrounded by it, and can move within it. New spatial models must emerge. Items can be fixed within the world or float within the user's field of view. By tracking head and eye movements, elements can be placed within their cone of focus, depending on context and need. Another key metaphor is physical presence, how the user is represented within the spatial interface. This is often done through the visualization of the user's hands. An intuitive example is the interface for Google's Tilt Brush. The non-drawing hand is dynamically wrapped in a flexible interface structure. You use both hands to make selections. And mixed reality brings together a collection of natural user interface technologies described earlier into a cohesive blended experience. But while its interactions are rooted in our physical experience, its interface, a mix of existing metaphors with a few new ones added in, is simultaneously familiar and completely alien to most computer users. Here is a quick overview of the 5 building blocks that makes up the Microsoft HoloLens user experience.
Gaze is the first form of user interaction on HoloLens. It tracks where a person's head is turned to target items in the environment. To interact with those items, you use gestures. The sensors on HoloLens read specific movements of your hands. Voice allows you to speak commands to control action in your app. Recognizing the world around you is done through spatial mapping. It creates a mesh of a room, allowing your holograms to interact with the surfaces that it finds. You can use this information to set holograms on a table, stick them on a wall, or interact with the furniture in your room. Finally, there is spatial sound. 3D sound makes the experience more immersive. Sound from holograms is realistic and can come from all directions.
So it struck me probably about a month or two ago when I started working with the Microsoft HoloLens that as someone who's been teaching interaction design for probably 15, 20 years now, I was completely unprepared for a form of interaction that's focused on gaze and gesture. We're deeply embedded in our traditional computer metaphors. It's going to take quite a while for us to start to rethink and redevelop new metaphors. Our paradigms are shifting, and the majority of working UI and UX designers are completely unprepared for the changes it will bring. So Wellington, New Zealand is a hotbed of mixed reality research because Weta Workshop, the renowned special and visual effects studio, is a key partner in a product called Magic Leap. Magic Leap is a secretive startup, probably the most best-funded startup in the world right now, with a product that projects a digital light field directly into your eye. This will provide unmatched realism and depth of field. In a system such as this, one responds to virtual objects as if they are real. Users describe the system as living in a lucid dream and talk about a coming world in which systems will be embedded in our eyewear and we will no longer have any use for screens because mixed reality will become our everyday reality. But as you see in this video, the interactions that take place, like on the HoloLens, are a mixture of traditional computing metaphors, the finger click, and those we have become familiar with using gestural and touchscreen interfaces, like a swipe or a wave. Over time, new gestural language will need to be defined. I began this talk referencing an emerging paradigm of user experience, where our digital and physical worlds become one. This convergence is coming sooner than you think. The timeline that I'm hearing is 4 years, and tools such as the Hololens that give you a taste of this experience are available now. This new convergence will provide a unique opportunity for designers, engineers, and technologists to work together to define and shape the experience of this emergent new medium. Design will be the differentiator here. So these are the kinds of opportunities that excite me as a designer and a user interface researcher. There's a lot of interesting work to be done. Thank you.